There was a time when cycling was just a means of transportation, but we all know things have changed. Over the years, cycling turned into a whole sport, and today it's one of the most watched sports out there. In this video, let's take a look at how cycling as a sport has evolved over the years, starting from the early years of people using bicycles to the present day. Let's get right into it. First up, here's the untold story of bicycles. As most people know, cycles have been there since the early 1800s, but if we skim through history, we can see that the basic design of a bicycle was even present in 1493. This was when Italian artist Giacomo Caprati sketched the idea. Some reports also state that someone also built a different version of the bicycle in 1791 in France, but it never became functional for some reason. This is why mostly the bicycle built by Karl von Drais, a German civil servant, is considered the first practical bike ever. And to be honest, this version didn't look anything like the ones we see around us today. Next up, it took decades for cycling to become a sport. Even after being in existence and used since the early 1800s, it wasn't until the 31st of May 1868 that cycling officially became a sport. The first documented cycling race was a 1,200-meter race starting from the entrance of St. Cloud Park and ending at the fountains of the park in Paris. And the person who won it was the Englishman James Moore. History reports tell that Moore rode a bike that had solid rubber tires. This is interesting because such tires are used today as well. After this, an inner-city bicycle race was also held, meaning that the participants had to travel on a bicycle from Paris to Rouen, and surprisingly, James Moore won this one as well. This time, the Englishman covered a distance of 135 kilometers in 10 hours and 25 minutes. This also includes the time he spent walking the cycle up the steep hills. Not long after, road racing became a widespread practice in Europe, but England, on the other hand, didn't have the right roads for the sport to become famous. Following up, the US also turned cycling into a sport. After Europe, the United States followed in its footsteps, and the first recorded cycling race in the US was organized on the 24th of May 1878 in Boston. For those who don't know, this was about 13 years before basketball was invented. Interesting, right? But even after this, there was no official cycling club in the country up until 1887. In 1887, an official club was formed that would hold sponsored races and time-distance events. From what we know, members of this club later became national champions and Olympic team members. By the time the 1890s arrived, the country already had hundreds of cycling tracks showing how popular the sport had become in such a short amount of time. There was a very famous circuit that stretched from Boston to San Francisco, and reportedly over 600 professional cyclists traveled on it. In the US, the sport got much-deserved publicity in 1899 when a rider named Charles M. Murphy rode on a wooden track and covered a mile in just 57.8 seconds. Yes, this was the same Murphy who we know as Mile a Minute Murphy. Not just that, the sport became even more popular in 1899. During the 1890s, a new cycling trend began when the 6-day race was introduced. In this type of race, the riders would cycle for 142 hours, hoping to win the $10,000 prize money. Not to mention, these 6-day races were almost famous among international cyclists. With that being said, this was also the time when the form of racing changed from a one-man team to a two-man team. Up until the 1930s, these 6-day races were something the riders looked forward to. But after this, they stopped holding them in the US, but countries like Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany still had large crowds interested in these races. While we're at it, it's important to look at when women started participating in this sport. Cycling, just like any other sport, was also something that only men could do. But during the late 1900s, 1984 to be precise, women also became a part of this sport. This was the year when the first ever Olympic cycling race for women was organized. But even at the time, professional cycling was barely known among the female population. However, to be clear, this problem was restricted to the sport because, other than competing in races, women were riding bikes for a long time. Anyways, steady steps finally paved the way for women to appear at the forefront of the sport. They started showing up to races and even demanded membership in the League of American Wheelmen. Not just that, they soon swapped those big heavy skirts with bloomers, and that's how riders like Aisha McGowan, Kate Courtney, and Amity Rockville continue the journey. Now let's talk about the modern cycling sport. If we talk about modern racing, we could consider the time when the races were introduced to countries like Italy, Netherlands, and Spain because at this point almost everyone was obsessed with the sport. The early 1900s are considered the golden golden age of cycling as a sport, because in 1903 the famous 21-day-long Tour de France was introduced, which has continued every year since then except for the years of World War I and II. Some other races that rank just behind the Tour de France are Grand 3-week Tours of Spain and Italy called the Vuelta a España and Giro d'Italia, respectively. The Giro is organized every year in May and June, Vuelta in September, and Tour de France in July. Not just that, the sport even has world championships for it, which are held in the month of October. And all these races aren't ordinary. Today, the whole world watches them, riders from around the world participate, and the prizes mount as high as $2.5 million. Not to mention, World War II also impacted the way racing was done before. Up until the late 20s, European road racing was sponsored by bicycle manufacturers, but soon after that, national and regional teams of riders were introduced, and then World War II happened. When the war ended and trade sponsors returned, things changed once again. Teams were now considering various sponsors, and these sponsors weren't restricted to bicycle manufacturers. In fact, automobile manufacturers, banks, and even insurance companies started sponsoring teams, and that's how the sponsoring system of modern racing transformed. The same approach is used today as companies support specific teams. Soon after, the Great Depression hit. Before the stock market crash in 1929, no one knew that the Great Depression was arriving. The people who were participating in races and enjoying the best days of their lives were suddenly thrown into the worries of getting a job and food for their families. From 1929 till 1939, the six-day races waned, and naturally, the interest in cycling started fading away. Even after things had improved, it wasn't until the 1980s that American riders started riding again, and this time they dominated the Olympic Games in LA in 1984. Not just that, in 1986, Greg LeMond, an American, won the first of his 3 Tour de France, and that's how Americans started taking an interest in the sport once again. In England, however, the turn of the 20th century resulted in the declined popularity of the sport. The arrival of automobiles only brought people away from cycling, and races like Pro Tour and milk races were soon abandoned. But Asia and Australia were immune to this sudden disinterest. Tour Down Under in Australia, Japan Cup, and the Tour of Langkawi still saw hundreds of fans line up to watch the races. Lastly, here's what the sport looks like today. Looking at the sport's long history, we can see that cycling has developed a lot for its own good. Today, bicycle racing is considered an Olympic sport. Not only that, even though the sport faced a massive decline in interest at the time, it's still one of the most popular sports all around the world, especially in Europe. Apart from Europe, the countries that are the most devoted to racing include the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, France, Spain, and Switzerland. But that's not all. Countries like the US, UK, Luxembourg, Australia, and Colombia are also internationally involved in organizing and participating in this sport. While bicycle racing didn't have many types to it a decade or two ago, it comes in different variations today. In fact, you might not even know about many kinds of bicycle racing. Today, riders participate in different races such as road bicycle racing, track cycling, cyclocross, and BMX. Not just that, some other types also include mountain bike racing, gravel racing, motor-paced racing, and cycle speedway. Some lesser common forms of bicycle racing are freestyle BMX and artistic cycling, as they don't have any recognition in international championships just yet. So that's all how cycling, from being only a mode of transportation, turned into a world-renowned sport. And with this, it's time to wrap this up, fam. What do you think about this video? Do let us know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you back here with more amazing videos. See you in the next one.